This was another week of paradox for NASA's Artemis programs. The same two themes that have dominated the news for the past month or so are about work that simultaneously is in opposition to the other. At the same time that NASA was announcing two high-visibility milestones for Artemis II launch preparations, the agency was also announcing that the centerpieces of that mission are, in effect, broken, along with Artemis itself. Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for your time as always. I'd wondered rhetorically if President Trump or Elon Musk or soon-to-be NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman thought that Artemis was broken. But the space agency declared itself on Friday that they shouldn't be doing this and Artemis needs to be revitalized. That was as a part of publication of the skinny version of the president's fiscal year 2026 budget request. Long rumored, long expected, and to the surprise of few, Trump and Musk finally announced that they want to terminate all the government Artemis programs, exploration ground systems, Orion, and Gateway in addition to SLS, and start over. Musk's Starship and SpaceX, his company, are obvious heavy favorites to replace all those programs before the decade is out, as someone once said. The request is just the start of a months-long budget process. As many of us will say this year, the budget request is not a done deal, so there will be plenty of time to look at the details and how much sense it makes. It's a political game, so I'll see your Artemis paradox and raise you a political one. The U.S. Congress is the other player in the political game, and they will have to decide whether to terminate these Artemis programs and go along with a historically large cut to NASA's budget as a whole, and even bigger cuts to other NASA directorates outside of Artemis. I'll go through a couple of initial takeaways from this skinny budget request, and there was another Artemis III SLS milestone this week, for what would be the last SLS, to go through later in the show, as they say. But let's start with the latest Artemis II news. It was a week of big and high visibility milestones for Artemis II preparations. The most significant occurred on Thursday, May 1st, when prime contractor Lockheed Martin officially turned over the Artemis II Orion spacecraft to Exploration Ground Systems, completing what looks like the standard DD-250 form. The official handover signifies Lockheed's completion of assembly and test of the Artemis II Orion. Pictures released that afternoon showed the spacecraft being secured on a transporter that will move Orion from the industrial operations zone of the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building to the multi-payload processing facility in the Kennedy Space Center industrial area. During the span of time that these pictures were taken, the crane lifting the spacecraft out of the final assembly systems test cell had positioned it on the transporter, transferred the load, and had been disconnected. These are the first views of the spacecraft in several weeks, and we can see those final two large-scale installations in place. The forward bay cover is installed on the crew module, and we can now see the ring and feet subassembly of the launch abort system also attached. The ring and feet are the bottom attach points between the LAS Motor Adapter Truss Assembly, or MATA, and the Orion crew module structure. I've noted in videos beginning back in March that EGS had moved attachment of this part of the truss assembly up to this point in preparations. That get-ahead task is expected to streamline operations to attach the LAS tower to Orion later in the year. With Orion now handed over to EGS, the only remaining hardware element yet to be delivered is the Orion stage adapter, which will connect Orion to SLS later in the year. Right now, the next step is to move Orion to the MPPF and begin a few months of commodity loading. Propellants for the service module and crew module will be loaded, along with other propulsion system fluids, cabin atmosphere gases, coolant fluids, and so on. The propellants in particular are toxic and hypergolic, so the area has to be cleared for servicing those commodities, and some of them have to be loaded one at a time. The Orion schedule remains the critical path to launch readiness, and EGS spacecraft offline operations is hoping to finish all the work in the MPPF in the next 3 months, so basically by the end of July, beginning of August. If you're interested in a rundown of the work that EGS has planned to get Orion ready to stack on SLS, I recently interviewed Marcos Peña, who is NASA Operations Manager for EGS spacecraft offline operations. I covered that in 2 videos recently. Part 2 should be up there now. and I put links to both of those videos in the description. Going back to the beginning of the week, NASA Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs confirmed that the replacement engine for the number 4 core stage engine position was installed beginning last week on Friday, April 25th. By the beginning of this week, the team was working to complete hard mating the engine, RS-25 engine 2061. The stage is stacked with the rest of the SLS vehicle on Mobile Launcher 1 in Vehicle Assembly Building High Bay 3. Eventually, they will do leak checks between the stage and engine interfaces, and then later on, the engine controller will be powered up with the rest of the stage. Stephen Clark reported a new detail about the engine replacement in his story for Ars Technica that I was not given back in March. Engine 2063, the original one, had a hydraulic leak, but the story adds the useful detail that the leak was associated with the hydraulic actuator for the engine's main oxidizer valve. As an aside, the Engine 2063 hardware is of the same 20-year-old vintage as its Engine 2061 replacement. However, that hardware was taken out of storage and put together at Stennis Space Center about 10 years ago. With the engine remove and replace work essentially complete, on Wednesday, April 30th, the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, or ICPS, was lifted out of its delivery canister, called the vertical transportation fixture, which was parked on the floor of the VAB transfer aisle back on April 15th. The stage was lifted up into High Bay 3, lowered down over the launch vehicle stage adapter, and mated. In a social media post on Friday, April 2nd, NASA KSC Public Affairs posted that hard mate of the stage to the LVSA was completed the day before, May 1st. Stacking of the ICPS is the last lift operation planned for several months. The working elements of the SLS rocket are now bolted together, and preparations are already underway to begin test and checkout of the boosters, core stage, LVSA, and ICPS with the mobile launcher and the ground launch control systems. All the ground side plates on the mobile launcher umbilicals for SLS need to be mated to the vehicle or flight side plates. In addition to propellants, fluids, and air conditioning, the mobile launcher supplies power to Orion and SLS up until a few minutes before liftoff, and the umbilicals also connect command and data channels between the ground launch systems and, in this case, the two flight control systems. The SLS flight computers are in control of flight from liftoff until the ICPS separates, and then the ICPS flight computers take over until Orion separates a few hours later. All three of those flight control systems also have to intercommunicate during the countdown and launch. There is also other closeout work to choreograph with test and checkout, such as application of spray-on foam insulation to the bolted flange between the bottom of the LVSA and the top of the core stage. Taking a look at where Artemis II preparations are after these high-visibility milestones are complete, Exploration Ground Systems and Comet Prime contractor Amentum are now working on integrated operations on SLS and the VAB, and are beginning spacecraft offline operations on Orion, beginning with the move to the MPPF. As April came to a close, Orion final assembly was completed by Lockheed Martin, with those final installations made sometime prior to the pictures we saw taken on May 1st. The RS-25 engine swap for Core Stage Engine 4 was completed, followed quickly by stacking of the ICPS on top of the LVSA as May begins. NASA moved Orion from the ONC building to the MPPF on Saturday, May 3rd. After this, we may not see as much of Orion and SLS for the next few months. The rest of the spring will be loading propellant tanks, mating umbilical plates, testing connections, powering up avionics, and performing systems checkouts. The next big milestone will be when Orion moves from the MPPF to the Launch Abort System facility. We may see the Orion stage adapter arrive in Florida before that, and in between now and then we'll be looking for updates on the status of Orion commodity loading in the MPPF and SLS integrated test and checkout in the VAB. After months of signs from President Trump and Elon Musk, and news leaks that they were going to reset Artemis and pivot NASA exploration to Mars, they finally declared in public that's what they want. The skinny version of the fiscal year 2026 budget request was published on Friday, May 2nd, confirming previous anonymous leaks of news about those plans. In addition to crushing the Science Directorate budget, the budget request immediately terminates the Gateway program and terminates Exploration Ground Systems, Orion, and SLS after the Artemis III mission. All in all, NASA's budget is cut from just under $25 billion to just under $19 billion, which is almost a 25% cut. There's going to be a lot more to talk about in the next few weeks, but here are some initial takeaways. The first one is that there would be an Artemis IV and beyond in this new plan. Musk is a close executive and political ally of Trump's, and SpaceX would be the heavy favorite to win new government contracts to replace all the programs that they are terminating. Since the election, there have been many signs that Trump and Musk were looking for a bigger reset of Artemis than just canceling SLS, for example. Past and present leadership of NASA's Exploration Directorate were forced to leave the agency after inauguration. There were those leaks of discussions inside the White House. And there were stories that foreshadowed the budget released in the past several weeks. Another takeaway is that even though there's no guarantee that Artemis III will be a lunar landing mission, that assumption should allow this budget plan to immediately terminate SLS upgrades in development, along with infrastructure under construction. Several contracts will have to be exited, not just ones for SLS, but also Orion's production contract, which already runs through Artemis VIII. As I've noted, Boeing is one of the contractors with the shortest contract options right now, only through Artemis IV. Most of the other SLS contracts with other companies run out to that same Artemis 8, 9, 10 timeframe, and those would have to be bought out too. In terms of programs being terminated, we know about one exception, which is the HLS program that has contracts with SpaceX and Blue Origin. The other program is EHP, which partners with Axiom Space on their Axiom EMU lunar surface spacewalk suit. It's not clear if there are any changes to that program or not. Speaking of Artemis III, the long-standing assumption that Artemis III will be a lunar landing mission also brings up all the long-standing questions about alternatives to that mission, and that's something that won't be going away anytime soon, given the delays to the programs involved. It's not a takeaway, but it's worth repeating a lot. The budget request is not a done deal. There is likely more support in the industry and community for an Artemis do-over by Trump and Musk than for what they propose to do with the science budget, but the budget outcome is going to come down to support in Congress. If we go back to the questions that came up over the weeks and months since the election pointed to big changes, this skinny budget finally provides explicit answers to some of those questions. It confirms that Trump and Musk believe that most of Artemis is broken, since they are proposing the elimination of 4 of the 6 programs. Now that we have most of the answers from Trump and Musk in the outline of their budget plan, all eyes are on what Congress will say and do in response. The next step in the process will be the full budget request, but we got the key details in this skinny budget, and there should be time to start going over all the implications before we get the full release. There's a lot more to say in the coming weeks about the future that this will lead to. Before any of the budget news was released, Boeing moved the Core Stage-3 liquid oxygen tank into the spray-on foam insulation cell at Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans on Friday, April 25th. Pictures of the move were published by NASA on April 30th. The tank is going through the thermal protection system application part of its production. Boeing completed application of a coat of corrosion protection primer on the tank in Cell P of Building 131 at MAF in March, and moved the tank out of that cell into Area 6 of Building 103 on March 26th. Over the last month, the tank was prepared for foam sprays in Cell N, with the installation of wiring harness runs for instrumentation, and studs that will eventually hold equipment like brackets for propellant feed lines and pressurization and vent lines. The tank was moved into Cell N 3 days after the Core Stage-3 liquid hydrogen tank was moved out, as Boeing worked to try to make up time lost over the past 2 years due to issues with production tools and facilities. Welding of the liquid oxygen tank was slowed during much of 2023 to resolve issues with tooling, and foam sprays of the LH2 tank were delayed in 2024 to resolve issues with equipment in that cell. Once the LOX tank SOFI applications are complete, the tank can be prepared for the forward join, where it will be stacked with the inner tank and forward skirt, and then those elements will be functionally interconnected and integrated. Eventually, the LH2 tank will be mated with that subassembly, and after more interconnecting and integration work, the top 4/5 of the stage will be transported to Kennedy Space Center for final assembly. This unit is assigned to Artemis III, and as it happened, the Orion and Starship programs had even bigger delays, which pushed the target launch date to mid-2027. At the end of last year, Boeing was working to complete production of Core Stage 3 by the end of 2025, but sometime in 2026 still seems more realistic. Final assembly of this stage will be the first at the Kennedy Space Center in the new Core Stage Vertical Integration Center in VAB High Bay 2 there. So these SLS production milestones will be one of the things to continue to watch for during the remainder of this year, as we continue to watch and wait for updates on the progress of all the programs delivering hardware for Artemis III. With the clarity now that President Trump and Elon Musk have proposed a complete reset of Artemis after Artemis III, and Congress emphasizing this race with China to land the next astronauts on the moon, that will increase attention on those preparations for the Artemis III lunar landing mission, not just for SLS, but also Axiom, Orion, and Starship. Beyond that off-ramp, the big questions we currently have for the Artemis IV elements will remain for whatever their alternatives would be, since that will be the backup option if a lunar landing isn't possible on Artemis III. A fourth SLS would require completing Block 1B development and related construction, and the questions there are the familiar ones. How much will that cost, and when will it be ready for Artemis IV? Those same questions will apply to the administration's new alternative, since this is a timed race, even though China's detailed lunar landing development schedule is just as secret as the schedules for SpaceX and Blue Origin. Speaking of the next NASA administrator, the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee voted on Wednesday, April 30th, to advance Mr. Isaacman's nomination to the full Senate. The vote was 19 yeas and 9 nays. It remains the wide expectation that he will be confirmed when it comes to a vote on the floor. The timing of that confirmation vote isn't clear yet. As noted online, the nomination was placed on the Senate Executive Calendar, calendar number 97. Prior to the vote, the ranking members of the committee, the Republican chair, Senator Ted Cruz, and the ranking Democrat, Senator Maria Cantwell, spoke about their upcoming vote, which was one of several items on the agenda of the executive session. Both supported the nomination, but both again emphasized in their remarks that a main condition of their support was Mr. Isaacman's commitment to the plan to return to the moon first before Mars. Here's what Senator Cruz said almost at the top of the session.
Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation will come to order. Today we'll consider a Coast Guard promotion, 2 consequential nominations, and 16 bills. Let me begin with Jared Isaacman, the President's nominee for NASA Administrator. Mr. Isaacman is a successful entrepreneur with a bold, boundary-pushing vision for space exploration. As we heard at his nomination hearing earlier this month, quote, NASA was built to do the near impossible. I agree. But NASA's plans for space must remain grounded in reality and align with our strategic interests. Existing law directs NASA to establish a, quote, sustained human presence in cislunar space or on the moon. Federal law explicitly calls the moon a, quote, stepping stone to reaching Mars. In other words, our path to predominance in space begins with the Artemis missions. Mr. Isaacman acknowledges this. As he told us, quote, I'm committed to following the law, and as a lifelong space enthusiast, I would like nothing more than to see lunar operations become continuous, enduring, and routine. For Isaacman, NASA can pursue Martian objectives. Yes, absolutely. But these should, quote, not detract from the near-term objective of returning to the moon first. Given this explicit commitment, I support Mr. Isaacman's confirmation.
And here is what Senator Cantwell said.
And on the Isaacman nomination comes before us with a wealth of business experience and space experience. I do think that innovators at this point in time with a commitment to keeping on to the moon mission is the key requirement that we have to have in this position. While it's not clear to me where the Trump administration will ultimately end up on the NASA budget, and I have concerns about some of their proposed cuts today, Mr. Isaacman seems to be committed to the current plan for both lander redundancy, space launch systems, and returning to the moon as fast as possible. I think this is a very big competitive issue for the United States of America. That competitiveness is not just a goal, it's a reality that someday we may wake up and find ourselves falling behind. So today I will support his nomination and hope that we will continue to get leadership out of the administration on clarification of supporting a robust NASA budget. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
As it turned out, the rumors were true, and the Trump administration will propose a new law that the science budget be cut in half and that the Artemis programs be terminated now or very soon. So now the attention turns to the next time that Mr. Isaacman appears before the House and Senate. He inherits this NASA budget, and he will be the one to sell it to Congress. Thanks as always for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative, and consider subscribing to find out what's going on with Artemis every week. If you're willing to make a one-time donation to support what we do, we would really appreciate it. I put a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the description. Teddy would have to stay home, but your donations would make it possible for me to make more field trips to NASA centers and contractor facilities here in the US. Also recently added memberships to this YouTube channel, and I want to thank all the people who have joined so far. I'm posting additional videos there and more frequent updates on what's happening during the week. I included a separate link to join in the description, but you can also click on the Join button on this page above the description, and there's also a place to join on the channel homepage. Thanks again for your time.